The cold morning wind blew leaves across the glass entrance of the city's most luxurious building, as all the candidates arrived in imported cars, designer clothes, and expensive perfumes. Among them, a thin young woman in a simple dress, already wrinkled from the journey, parked a rusty bicycle next to the parking lot filled with Maseratis and Ferraris. Eyes turned to her like sharp blades, some with disdain, others with stifled laughter. A receptionist raised an eyebrow, scrutinizing her from head to toe as if her presence were a grotesque breach in the harmony of the room. Murmurs spread. On a bicycle? What a joke! With each step across the polished marble, her worn shoes echoed like drums of embarrassment, until one of the candidates laughed out loud and theatrically opened the door for her, like someone mocking a caricature. The embarrassment was total, and the girl felt as if she had invaded a stage that wasn't hers, with everyone ready to boo her before she even began. At the height of tension, just as the stairs were pushing her out without a word, the elevator door opened, and out stepped a man of overwhelming presence, impeccable suit, gleaming watch, the master of everything around him, the millionaire who would choose his new director. Silence was immediate. He scanned the room with a cold gaze, ignoring the suited men who lined up like statues, until he fixed his eyes precisely on her, the girl on the bicycle who was cowering in embarrassment. And then, with the calm of someone who dictates fate, he said firmly, "Don't waste time, the position is already filled. She will be my new director." The impact was like a silent explosion. Laughter died in the throat, sneers turned into expressions of shock. What had seemed like a grotesque error transformed into a social judgment in reverse, as if the world had been turned upside down in a matter of seconds. That was just the first twist. What will happen when the truth of the past comes to light? You can't imagine the weight of the next chapter. If this story has touched you, subscribe to the channel, like it, and write in the comments what you would do in her place. Your opinion could be the next inspiration for a new chapter. The sky over Manhattan was overcast, the heavy clouds reflecting in the mirrored glass of the buildings as if the day carried an omen. The avenue teemed with honking horns, hurried footsteps, and indifferent glances. But behind that imposing urban facade, in the heart of a building that seemed to touch the sky, something was about to happen that would change destinies silently and irrevocably. The reception hall looked more like an art gallery than a waiting area. White marble, immense chandeliers that hung like crystal waterfalls, modern paintings framed in gold. The candidates for the position, all impeccably dressed, spread out like birds of prey, sharpening their claws. Each one was flaunting something: Swiss watches, tailored suits, perfumes with difficult names, looks of superiority. It was a silent battle of status, where no detail went unnoticed. Some spoke softly on their cell phones, citing figures and deals that probably didn't even exist, just to inflate their own presence. Others leafed through leather folders, pretending to review reports they already knew by heart. There was an air of anticipation, but also of collective vanity, until the revolving door opened and a draft of cold air entered, bringing someone who stood out from all the rest. A young woman with her hair tied back simply, skin marked by daily exertion, clean clothes but without a hint of luxury, pushed her rusty bicycle inside until it rested discreetly in the corner of the building. The gesture was small, but it caused a silent earthquake. Eyes turned to her like cruel spotlights. Muffled laughter emerged like snakes slithering across the marble. Someone murmured jokingly, "Must have the wrong building. This isn't a delivery agency." Another, bolder, burst out laughing, drawing attention to the situation. The security guard almost stopped her, but upon seeing the badge printed on plain paper with the interview address, he simply looked away, unable to hide his contempt. With each step toward the reception desk, the feeling of inadequacy grew within her like a storm. The worn heel of her shoe tapped against the polished floor, reverberating through the room as if betraying her poverty. She felt the stares piercing her skin, felt each muffled laugh like an invisible stab. The receptionist, with perfectly contoured lipstick and a razor-sharp smile, looked at the name on the clipboard and paused deliberately, creating seconds of suspense, only to blurt out, "The waiting room is over there." But the way he said "over there" sounded as if he'd pointed to a trench of humiliation. The other applicants glanced at each other, and some snickered, already mentally betting on how long this girl would last before being rejected. The young woman sat in the corner, trying to hide her labored breathing from the bike ride. As she adjusted the hem of her dress, she felt the stark contrast between the cheap fabric and the suits lined up around her. But there was something in her eyes that no one noticed. Behind the apparent shyness and embarrassment he tried to hide, lurked a silent spark of conviction, as if he knew something none of those suited and booted could have imagined. The room, which seemed dominated by arrogance, was about to become the stage for a turn of events that none of those present would have dared to anticipate. She wasn't born for that marble hall, or so everyone would believe if they knew her story. Since childhood, she carried on her shoulders the weight of a destiny that seemed written on pages stained with poverty. She grew up in a forgotten neighborhood, where the houses had leaky roofs, the asphalt dissolved into dust, and children learned early on the difference between dreaming and surviving. Her father had disappeared before she was even 5, leaving only an old bicycle which would later become her only inheritance. Her mother, exhausted from working double shifts in cheap restaurants, struggled to keep her daughter in school, even though she was often forced to study in the dim light of a streetlight, sitting on the steps of her house because the electricity bill had been cut yet again. Still, there was something that sustained her, a lively, almost unsettling intelligence that seized every opportunity to learn. While other children played, she devoured books borrowed from the small community library, dreaming of a future without invisible bars. Every page was an escape, every word a promise that life could be different. But the world doesn't usually show mercy to poor dreamers. In high school, she suffered the cruel label of lunchbox girl because she always carried simple food in scratched plastic containers, while her classmates flaunted expensive fast food. She remembered the collective laughter when one of the richer boys deliberately dropped her lunchbox on the floor, scattering rice and beans like crumbs of embarrassment. The scene was etched in her mind like fire, but it didn't break. She swallowed her tears and silently promised herself that one day she would be in a position where she wouldn't have to lower her head. By the time she entered college, she was already working as a server in a small coffee shop, balancing trays and books simultaneously. It was there that she learned to observe people, especially the suits who hurried past, talking about millions as if they were coins. She served them politely, but inside she recorded every word, every detail, as if studying a secret language of power. She often left work riding her father's bike, braving rain, cold, and looks of pity mixed with contempt. But the bike wasn't just transportation. It was a symbol. Each pedal stroke was a reminder that, though slow, I was moving forward. When her mother fell ill and the medical bills became unbearable, she considered giving up everything. It was during this period that she discovered a strength she never imagined she had, the ability to not only survive, but to continue believing that the future could be achieved. She was accepted into competitive internships, always being the different one among the others, the one who arrived by public transportation or bicycle, but also the one who delivered more than asked. And it was precisely this silent strength that now pulsed within her in that building, even though no one saw it. Every look of contempt she received there was merely a repetition of everything she had faced since she was a girl. And although her posture was shy, inside was a wall of memories that kept her standing. She knew the others were laughing at her bike, but what they didn't know was that every scratch on that scrap of junk was the mark of a story of resistance. And it was this same story that, in a few hours, would transform humiliation into silent justice before everyone's eyes. The previously silent reception hall was beginning to transform into a theater of vanity. Some candidates, perhaps trying to ease the tension, began chatting among themselves, but the tone was one of disguised competition. Comments about investments, trips to Europe, and influential connections were thrown out like bait, hoping for admiration. The young woman remained in the corner, quiet, but her uncomfortable presence seemed to stir something in the others, as if they needed to reassure them that she didn't belong there. One of the young men, tall in a sharp navy suit and a cynical smile, decided to be the voice of the cruelty many were hiding. He looked at his friend next to him and in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, blurted out, "Want to bet how long she lasts in the interview? 10 minutes? 5, maybe." The other laughed and replied, "Don't exaggerate, friend. She won't. Make it to 3. The most she'll do is stumble over her own words and leave crying." Laughter spread. Some tried to hide it by coughing. Others stared directly at the girl, waiting for a reaction that didn't come. She remained firm, but inside her heart was beating like a racing drum. The young man didn't stop there. He opened his leather wallet and took out a $50 bill, holding it up like a victory cup. 50, and she won't even get past the first question. Who's up for it? A murmur of approval ran through the group, and others began taking notes, turning the interview into a kind of arena where she was the gladiator, exposed to ridicule before she even fought. One of the bolder candidates approached her and, with a venomous smile, said, "If I were you, I'd quit now. You'll avoid embarrassment, and frankly, you'll save everyone here time. This kind of room wasn't made for people like you." The sentence cut through the air like a blade, and the young woman took a deep breath, trying not to buckle under the weight of humiliation. She looked up and stared for a moment at the young man waving the money, but said nothing. Her silence, instead of being read as strength, was interpreted as weakness, and the laughter grew even louder. The security guard at the counter watched the scene silently, but with the same contempt etched on his face, as if he truly agreed that the girl was a foreign body in an environment made only for the worthy. The receptionist, engrossed, pretended to organize papers, but kept her gaze fixed, savoring every detail of the embarrassment. And then, as if it were necessary to enhance the spectacle, the young man in the blue suit blurted out, "Let's agree. If by some miracle she passes, I'll double the bet. But everyone here knows miracles don't happen in interviews." The group laughed, and the young woman felt her palms sweat. But instead of hiding, she straightened her posture and calmly crossed her legs. A simple gesture, but one that carried a silent challenge. No one noticed at the time, but she was collecting every word, every laugh, like someone recording evidence for a future trial. Outside, the sky grew even darker, and thunder echoed in the distance. It seemed a symbolic answer, as if fate itself were about to intervene in the cruel bet made inside that building. The reception clock struck 9 o'clock sharp as the elevator doors opened with a soft metallic clang. An instant silence filled the room. All the candidates who minutes before had been enjoying cruel bets straightened their bodies like soldiers before a general. It was him, the millionaire, the master of that entire empire, a figure shrouded in tales of coldness and unshakable power. His footsteps echoed across the marble with a steady cadence, each tap of his imported shoe carrying the feeling that the air in the room belonged to him. His tailored grey suit seemed molded to his own body. His gold watch glinted under the lights, but it was his gaze that commanded silence, penetrating, calculating, as if assessing not just the clothes, but the very essence of each person before. The men in ties, who seconds before had displayed arrogant smiles, now lowered their eyes like children caught in mischief. He walked calmly through the room, receiving nervous greetings, eager handshakes, artificial compliments. He didn't respond to any. He walked as if he already knew the game, as if he could see behind the masks. It was then that he stopped, his eyes cold and attentive, fixed on the corner of the room where she sat discreet, still trying to recover from the humiliation she had just endured. Time seemed to stand still. She didn't dare look away, and for a moment, the two of them were caught in an invisible thread of recognition that no one could explain. While the other candidates shifted uncomfortably, he took a step toward her. "You," he said in a deep, firm voice that resonated like an order. The sound pierced the room, and immediately a few eyes lifted, confused, as if to confirm if he was really talking to the girl on the bicycle. "Stand up," he continued. Her heart raced. Her legs felt heavy, but she obeyed, rising slowly, feeling all eyes boring into her back. When she stood before him, the difference in worlds was stark. On one side, the man who symbolized wealth and absolute power. On the other, the simple girl, her skin still marked by the cold wind from her morning bike ride. He looked her up and down, but there was no contempt in his eyes. There was curiosity, as if trying to decipher something the others couldn't see. "What's your name?" he asked, and the room leaned forward, eager for the answer. She spoke firmly, almost surprising herself with the strength she found in her voice. He repeated the name softly, as if testing the sound, as if keeping an important detail to himself. The silence was absolute. The other candidates exchanged looks filled with disbelief. Some chuckled inwardly, thinking this was just an awkward moment that would confirm her defeat. But something in the way he looked at her made it clear there was more. He turned to the others, walked a few steps to the center of the room and said, "Let's cut this short. I don't have time to waste." He paused, looked at the young woman again, and before everyone declared, "The position is already filled. She will be my new director." The shock was immediate. A murmur ran through the room. Some widened their eyes, others let out nervous laughter. The girl, who minutes before had been the target of cruel bets, now became the center of a decision that turned all logic upside down. There was no explanation, no justification, only his absolute authority. The world seemed to have turned upside down in a matter of seconds, and the first connection between them was not one of long words or formal introductions, but of an unexpected, almost inexplicable choice that would forever mark the fate of both. The announcement fell over the room like a silent thunderclap, but the impact wasn't one of immediate acceptance. Instead, it was as if it had lit the fuse of a silent revolt. The candidates, stunned by the choice, began exchanging looks of disbelief. Some swallowed hard, others forced smiles that hid anger. But one of them couldn't contain himself. The young man in the blue suit, the one who had initiated the cruel bet moments before, stepped forward, laughing ironically. "With all due respect, sir," he said, his voice thick with sarcasm, "but this has to be a joke. The director, the one who arrived on a bicycle." His laughter echoed through the room, and others, feeling emboldened, began to spew venomous comments in low voices, audible enough to wound. "It's an insult," muttered a blonde candidate, crossing her arms. "We, with years of experience, being passed over for this." Another added, "It's a marketing ploy. It has to be. Charity looks good for the company's image." Every word was a public blow, every stifled laugh a reminder that to them she would never stop being the girl on the bike. The young woman standing before them all felt the weight of humiliation multiply. Her heart raced, her face burned, but her eyes remained steady, though silent. Her posture, seemingly fragile, was also an act of resistance. The millionaire watched everything silently, motionless, but his sharp gaze roamed every face, as if memorizing the features of each one who dared to laugh. The young man in the blue suit, however, did not stop. He moved closer to her, leaned his body toward her face, and whispered, loud enough for others to hear, "Don't kid yourself. He'll get sick of you in a week. And then, when you get kicked out, you'll go back to riding that ridiculous bike of yours home." The laughter exploded, undisguised now, openly echoing through the room like a collective judgment. The receptionist behind the counter let out a smile, pleased with the spectacle. The security guard, who had maintained a neutral expression until then, shook his head in disapproval, reinforcing the scene of contempt. The entire room transformed into an arena of humiliation, as if everyone needed confirmation, given his power, that this choice was absurd. And even the announcement coming from the millionaire's own mouth seemed insufficient to curb the collective venom. Her silence, however, was disturbing. Instead of crying, instead of screaming or defending herself, she simply stared at them. And in that look there was something few understood. It wasn't submission, but a record. Every word of contempt was stored within her, as if collecting evidence for a future reckoning. The tension reached a breaking point when the young man in the blue suit, still intoxicated by his own arrogance, raised his voice for all to hear. "This is an insult to the company, sir. We don't deserve to be placed on the same level as someone who barely makes it here with dignity." The millionaire then broke the silence. He didn't raise his voice, but every syllable he uttered carried the weight of authority. Be careful with your words. Often, the greatest strength lies in the silence of the humiliated, and you'll learn that yet. The room froze. The laughter ceased, but the tension hung in the air. She, even wounded, maintained her composure, not giving them the pleasure of seeing her broken. Deep down, she knew the humiliation was just another recurring scene in her life. But she also knew that this time, something different was happening. Poetic justice would not be long in coming. The room was still filled with the echo of laughter and the weight of silence that followed the millionaire's words. The young woman standing took a deep breath, her heart pounding, but behind her serene gaze lay something no one there could have imagined. The young man in the blue suit still wore a mocking smile, certain that his humiliation had been victorious. The other candidates exchanged glances filled with doubt and contempt, as if expecting her to retreat at any moment, apologize for daring to exist in that space, and return to her bicycle. But instead, she raised her head and spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air with the clarity of a blade. I knew I would be received like this. The silence that followed was absolute. Some frowned, uncomprehending. Others laughed ironically, thinking it was just a last gasp of dignity. But she continued, looking directly at the young man who had waved the $50 bills moments before. I knew they'd make jokes about the bike. I knew they'd bet against me, laugh at my clothes, my mannerisms. I've been through this before. More times than you can imagine. Her eyes, previously shy, now burned with an unexpected firmness. And you know what's funny? She said, turning to everyone one by one. Every time I was humiliated, every time they tried to belittle me, I learned. I learned to observe, to listen, to guard. While you laughed, I studied. While you bet against me, I worked twice as hard. While you believed I had no place here, I was already preparing to be here. The words fell over the room like hammer blows, slowly chipping away at the arrogant confidence of the others. Some looked away, unable to bear this unexpected confrontation. The young man in the blue suit tried to laugh, but his voice faltered. The girl took a step closer and added, I knew all this before I even walked through those doors, and yet I walked in. Because I didn't come to please you, I came to conquer what's mine. The final sentence echoed like a gunshot, and the room became a shattered mirror. No one dared laugh. The millionaire, until then silent, watched with a different intensity. It was as if her every word confirmed something he already sensed, as if he'd seen in her not just a candidate, but a flame that all the others there could never ignite. The young woman, without realizing it, had turned the tables. The public humiliation the others had tried to impose now became a showcase of courage. Her revelation wasn't just that she knew about the mockery, but that she was above it, transforming every wound into a scar of resistance. The young man in the blue suit, embarrassed, put the $50 bill back in his pocket, not daring to look up. For the first time, it wasn't she who felt small, but them. Her words hung in the air like a sentence. The room, previously dominated by laughter and contempt, fell into a thick silence. The millionaire didn't take his eyes off her, and there was something rare in his eyes. Not just curiosity, but a kind of recognition, as if he'd suddenly connected pieces of an ancient puzzle. He quickly waved his hand for everyone to wait, and beckoned the young woman to follow him. The elevator closed behind them, leaving the group in a hubbub of indignation and disbelief. Inside, in the cramped space, she breathed deeply, trying to control the whirlwind of emotions. He, motionless, observed every detail, the way she held her chin high, the serenity that seemed to conceal an enormous weight. When the elevator reached the top floor, the doors opened onto the company's penthouse, a vast glass-walled room where the entire city stretched out at their feet. He walked to the oak table and bluntly asked, "Who are you, really?" The young woman hesitated for a moment. Her gaze wandered over the illuminated city as if seeking strength from the buildings shimmering in the distance. Then she said, "You don't remember me, do you?" He frowned in confusion. She approached and in a firm voice added, "Years ago, when your company was still in its infancy, there was a small coffee shop on the corner of the old building. I was a server there. Every day you walked by, always in an impeccable suit, ordering the same coffee, never looking the waiter in the eye. I was there. I watched you. Every word you said on the phone about investments, every piece of advice you gave someone at the counter, every harsh sentence you hurled at desperate employees. I heard it all. He fell silent, trying to search his memory. Vague images of a coffee shop surfaced in his mind, flashes of a past he had never considered important. I didn't just serve your coffee, she continued. I studied. I wrote down the terms you used, researched at night, learned. While balancing trays and paying off debts, I absorbed every detail of what I heard from you. Without knowing it, you were my first business teacher. The revelation hit him like an invisible blow. The memory began to form more clearly. A girl in a simple uniform, always with an open book behind the counter, always attentive, silent. He had never paid her any attention, but now looking at the woman before him, the connection was undeniable. So you, he murmured, not finishing the sentence. Yes, she replied firmly. I came here because I'm not just the girl on the bike. I'm the result of everything you tried to ignore. Every coffee served was a lesson, every slight was fuel, every humiliation I suffered out there brought me to this floor. The millionaire took a deep breath, feeling for the first time in a long time a chink in his own cold armor. This wasn't just any candidate. She was someone who had grown up in the shadows of his own empire, someone who carried within her the reflection of what he had been and forgotten, a survivor. In that moment, he discovered not only who she was, but also who he himself had ceased to be. The next morning the building looked the same. Lights reflecting off the marble, hurried suits, impeccable receptionists. But something had changed. She wasn't there. The chair in the corner remained empty. The bicycle that had become a symbol of mockery wasn't parked at the entrance, and the silence surrounding her absence carried a weight no one dared comment on. The millionaire, accustomed to controlling every detail of the company, found her immediate absence strange. He asked the receptionist, but the answer was curt. She didn't show up. The receptionist's cold tone seemed almost satisfied, as if silently celebrating the girl's withdrawal. At first, he feigned indifference. If she didn't come, it's because she wasn't ready, he told himself, trying to hide the discomfort that had plagued him all morning. But as the hours passed, her absence became a presence. In the middle of meetings, while numbers and projections were presented, his mind would wander, returning to the steady gaze she'd given him in the face of laughter. He remembered every word spoken the day before, the revelation that he himself had been, without realizing it, the teacher of his own journey. It was as if he had been confronted by a mirror showing a forgotten part of his own history. At night, alone on the glass roof, he would stare at the city lights and wonder why it disturbed him so much. He had seen hundreds of candidates come and go, some even brilliant, but none had left this sudden emptiness. It was as if her silent courage had wrenched something from him, and now, in her absence, there was only an echo. Days passed. She did not return. She did not respond to the emails the office had sent, nor to the calls. It was as if she had disappeared from the entire city. The other candidates, now more relaxed, returned to circulating confidently, certain that this anomaly had resolved itself. But he could not ignore the nagging feeling of loss. Each morning, he would instinctively look toward the building's entrance, expecting to see the bicycle parked there, and found only the cold gleam of empty marble. And this emptiness haunted him. For the first time in years, meetings seemed endless. Business parties felt artificial, and even financial victories had a metallic aftertaste. He began to remember things he had buried, his own youth, the time when he too had been overlooked, underestimated, ignored. Perhaps that was what bothered him about her, or actually inspired him. She brought back what he had erased to become the statue of power everyone now revered, but which he himself no longer recognized. And so, in the silence of her absence, he began to miss not only the girl, but the version of himself that had once existed. It was a void no amount of money could fill, and he knew he needed to find her again, not just for her sake, but because in some inexplicable way he needed to find himself again. Her absence had already become routine. Days turned into weeks, and corporate life seemed to go on as usual, but not for him. The millionaire, once impenetrable and absolute, was beginning to be the target of different views. At meetings, some partners whispered about his impulsive decision to appoint an unknown director, a decision that, for everyone, had resulted in an embarrassing departure. The press, always alert to cracks, began to exploit the episode. As a sign of fragility, discreet headlines appeared in business columns. Strategic error or emotional impulse, the millionaire who appointed and lost a director in one day. On social media, the story went viral. A video discreetly recorded at the reception circulated. It showed the moment he pointed to the girl on the bicycle and announced his choice. Purposefully cropped to inflate the narrative, the video made it appear as if he had ridiculed the other candidates for the sake of media. Charity. Thousands of comments appeared, divided between criticism and mockery. "You want to appear like a hero and you've become a joke," said one. "Do you think a company is an NGO?" wrote another. The collective laughter that had previously fallen on him now turned against him. Investors began to question his lucidity, employees murmured about a loss of credibility, and even old allies regarded him with reservations. For the first time in years, his public image was wavering. At an international conference, while he was speaking about growth strategies, a journalist raised his hand and in front of hundreds of business people asked, "And your famous choice of director? How is that strategy working?" The room laughed, muffled but audible. He froze for a second, recovered coolly, but inside he felt the blow. Each laugh was a reflection of the same weapon he had previously tolerated against others, public contempt. It was karma, and he knew it. He returned home late, locked in. His penthouse, facing a city that no longer seemed so obedient. That episode, which could have been silently erased, now haunted him like a shadow. Her absence was the invisible thread pulling everything down. He was beginning to understand what it meant to be the target of collective judgment, what it meant to have his dignity questioned in public, what it meant to carry the weight of others' laughter on his face. And in this silent fall, where no amount of money could buy instant respect, he found himself before an uncomfortable mirror. The man he once was, the arrogant man who laughed at those cycling in the rain, was now remembered only for the incomplete gesture, for the decision that seemed ridiculous to everyone. But deep down, he knew the mistake wasn't in choosing her. The mistake was in losing her. External criticism was just the trigger. The real downfall didn't come from the newspapers, the investors, or the jokes repeated at every bar in the city. The downfall came from within. He, who had always lived surrounded by figures, victories, and luxury, now experienced an emptiness that expanded like cracks in concrete. The millionaire began to retrace his steps, questioning the decisions that had shaped his cold, unbreakable image. In the solitude of the penthouse, amid untouched glasses and windows that revealed the city in constant motion, he recalled details he had previously ignored, the looks of exhausted employees, the rush of meetings that crushed ideas, the way he passed through others' lives without even registering their names. And inevitably he remembered her, the girl on the bicycle, not as a lost employee, but as a symbol. She carried something he had lost along the way: dignity in poverty, courage in silence, steadfastness in the face of contempt. He began to break out of predictable routines, walking without security, observing the streets he had previously only crossed in armored cars. He saw workers braving the rain, mothers balancing, bags and children, young people studying in cheap cafes. Images that had previously been mere cityscapes now became mirrors of humanity. With each anonymous face, he remembered her, and her absence became unbearable. Within the company, his tone changed. Meetings previously dominated by haste and pragmatism began to gain pauses, moments of genuine listening. He surprised employees by asking about their personal stories, their struggles, their dreams. It wasn't a kind speech, but a genuine effort to reconnect. Some found it strange, others suspicious, but everyone sensed something was different. He also began revisiting places that had shaped his life. He returned to the coffee shop where she had worked, now nearly abandoned, with its creaking chairs and the smell of burnt coffee. He sat at the same counter and, for a moment, he could almost see her there, young, balancing books and trays. It was in that instant that he understood he hadn't just lost a candidate, but an opportunity to see what she had always been, an invisible force shaped by contempt, yet indestructible. The transformation wasn't theatrical. It didn't come with grand speeches or public gestures. It was silent. In the more attentive gaze, in the sleepless nights pondering choices, in the hands that trembled as he wrote a letter he'd never had the courage to send. And for the first time in years, he felt something money couldn't buy: regret. Not for what he'd done to her in the salon, but for what his entire life had done to the others who had always been invisible to him. From this emptiness, a new way of seeing the world was born, and with it, an increasingly urgent desire to find her again, not to offer her a position, but to ask for something much more difficult: forgiveness. The city continued its chaotic rhythm, but for him every street had become a search. For weeks, the millionaire roamed neighborhoods he'd never set foot in. He passed simple squares, hidden bookstores, small cafes, always hoping to find her. But it was like searching for shadows in the crowd, until one rainy afternoon fate intervened. He was walking slowly under a black umbrella when he heard the familiar sound of chains and thin tires rubbing against the wet asphalt. He looked up, and there she was, pedaling the same rusty bicycle, now even more scarred by time. His heart raced. Without thinking, he crossed the street, ignoring horns and puddles. "Wait!" he shouted, but the rain muffled his voice. She stopped only when she recognized him a few meters away. Her eyes, shielded by the shadow of his wet hood, held a mixture of surprise and caution. There was no evident anger, but there was no tenderness either. Only the firm silence of someone who knows the weight of their own history. He, breathless, felt for a moment that all the power accumulated through years of wealth was worthless before that simple, drenched yet unshakable figure. "I looked for you," he said, and his voice, for the first time in a long time, sounded not like an order, but like a confession. She didn't respond. She just watched, as if waiting for something more than words. He continued, his breath mingling with the cold afternoon mist. "I understood. I understood that this wasn't about a position, a bold decision to impress. You didn't need me to legitimize you. It was I who needed you to remind me of who I was." The sincerity in her voice shattered the armor he wore. The silence between them was thick, broken, only by the rain falling on the cobblestones. Finally, she dismounted her bike and approached, her eyes fixed on his. "And what do you want now?" she asked calmly, as if testing not just words, but intentions. He took a deep breath, swallowing the pride that had always defined him. "I want a chance, not to offer anything, but to listen. I want you to tell me what justice means to you. I want to learn, if you'll still let me." Those words weren't from a businessman accustomed to winning arguments, but from someone who had been defeated by his own heart. She studied him for long seconds, assessing not his soaked suit or the tone of his voice, but the transformation in his eyes. And for the first time since the morning she'd been ridiculed at the reception, she felt that before her was not the untouchable millionaire, but a man seeking redemption. Their reunion wasn't marked by grand gestures, but by that silent moment where two worlds collided again, this time not to humiliate, but to reveal the truth. Both had changed. The rain was easing, but it still dripped from rooftops and trickled down the streets, creating broken reflections of the city lights. They stood face to face, and the silence that enveloped them seemed to weigh more heavily than any words. For the first time, he didn't lean on his imposing presence or the authority of his voice. He was vulnerable, nearly naked before her, even wearing his most expensive suit. And it was in this contrast that she noticed the change. The millionaire who had once looked down on others now stood before her like a man seeking absolution. His eyes, however, still bore the scars of humiliation. The memory of the laughter at the reception, the $50 bill held aloft, the collective contempt, it all remained vivid in her mind. Part of her wanted to turn away, mount her bicycle, and disappear again, leaving him with the emptiness he had helped create. But there was another part, a quieter, deeper part, that saw here a rare opportunity, not for revenge but for choice. "You don't understand," she finally said, her voice calm but firm. "It's not about offering me a position, nor about trying to repair your image. What happened that day wasn't just about me. It was about everyone you, from the heights of your glass palaces, ignore. I was just a symbol of what you've always trampled on." He lowered his head, absorbing every word like a defendant listening to a sentence. She continued, "I didn't come back because I didn't need to be in that company to prove my worth. I already knew who I was, and you needed to lose to find out who you truly were." His breath hitched, and for a moment, the silence became unbearable. Then she took a deep breath, stepped forward, and said the sentence that would decide their fate. "I won't work for you. Not because I hate you, but because my life doesn't need to be tied to your world. But I will forgive, because I don't want to carry the weight of resentment. The judgment you already face is far greater than any punishment I could impose." The impact of those words was devastating and liberating at the same time. He looked up in disbelief, as if receiving a forgiveness he hadn't dared hope for. There was no victory on her face, only a painful recognition, the understanding that she wouldn't have a second chance to shape her destiny alongside him. She picked up her bike, mounted it slowly, and said before leaving, "What you do from now on is yours. Alone. Life has already taken care of giving me justice." And she rode off, leaving him standing in the middle of the wet street, surrounded by the distant sound of horns and a cold that seemed to penetrate to his bones. There was no audience, no cameras, no witnesses. But in that silent decision she had sealed the story. She would not be his employee. She would not be his piece of redemption. She would simply be the woman who showed that even the most powerful can be judged by the mirror of their own choices. And that goodbye, more than any forgiveness, would be the true finale. Night swallowed the city. The streets still shone with reflections of the rain, and the lights of the buildings streaked the sky like spears of glass. Up on the rooftop he stood alone, before the immense windows that revealed the world he had once believed he controlled. The crystal glasses on the table were intact. The gold watch perched on his heavy wrist now seemed nothing more than cold, worthless. Metal. In his eyes, emptiness. Below, distant, almost invisible, her silhouette disappeared between narrow streets, pedaling the rusty bicycle that had become a symbol of resistance. The sound of the chains, mixed with the night wind, seemed to echo all the way to the rooftop windows. He followed her with his gaze until he could see nothing, and for the first time in a long time, he felt small, not for lack of wealth, but for the absence of something no amount of money could restore. The chance to choose differently when there was still time. The city continued to pulse, indifferent to the silent drama that had just ended, and in the contrast between the man surrounded by luxury and the woman departing with dignity, there was the true sentence. Sometimes justice needs neither applause nor revenge. The silence of goodbye is enough. If you've made it this far, I want to hear your thoughts. What would you do in her shoes? Write in the comments, because your insight might inspire others. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell to continue receiving intense stories like this. And before you leave, click on the video that's currently appearing on your screen. It will surprise you even more.